The paper curled before it burned. At first, it resisted. Military maps are not delicate things. They are built to survive rain, mud, folding, and panic. They are printed on tough stock, treated, reinforced, designed to outlive the men who carry them. But flame is patient. It licked the lower corner, hesitated as if testing the audacity of the act, and then began to climb. Grid lines blackened, contour markings warped, coordinates precise, sacred, fought over shrunk into unreadable scars. No one spoke. Around the small, controlled fire, the soldiers watched in silence. Their faces were smeared with dust and exhaustion, their uniforms carrying the pale stains of long movement over hostile ground. Sweat ran down temples, cutting clean lines through dirt. One man adjusted his rifle sling. Another kept his eyes fixed not on the horizon, but on the map itself, as if memorizing its death. This was not panic, this was a procedure. And that was the part no one outside their unit would understand. Because in every military on Earth, a map like this was more than paper. It was an advantage. It was foresight. It was survival made visible. It represented hours of reconnaissance, analysis, interpretation. It was the distilled awareness of an entire command structure, and its protection was drilled into soldiers with absolute clarity. Never lose your map. Never surrender your map. Never destroy your map unless capture was certain and no other choice remained. But here there was no enemy in sight, no immediate threat, no encirclement, only open terrain, only distance, only choice, and still they burned it. The flame consumed a marked river crossing, then a ridgeline, then the thin pencil annotations, handwritten notes added by the patrol leader himself, corrections laid over official print, insights earned step by step across dangerous ground. Gone. One of the men shifted his weight, boots pressing into the dry earth. The air smelled faintly of smoke and canvas and sweat. Somewhere in the distance, wind moved through scrub, carrying the empty, indifferent sound of wilderness. The patrol leader crouched closest to the fire. He did not rush it. He did not tear the map into pieces or scatter it. He let it burn completely, methodically, until nothing remained that could be reconstructed. His eyes never left the flame, because he knew exactly what he was destroying, and exactly why. That far away from that quiet fire, inside reinforced headquarters rooms lined with radios and authority, the reaction would be very different. Confusion came first, then disbelief, then anger. Reports arrived in fragments, radio confirmations, after-action logs, casual mentions buried inside routine operational summaries. A map destroyed, deliberately, by friendly forces, not under threat of capture, not due to emergency compromise, intentionally. Senior officers stared at the wording, certain at first that it had to be a mistake. Maps were assets. Assets were protected. That was doctrine. That was the structure. That was the order. You did not destroy your own intelligence. Not unless you had failed. Not unless something had gone wrong. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Who authorized this? Why wasn't the map retained? What justification could possibly outweigh the loss of that information? Because in the institutional mind, information was power, and power was never discarded willingly. Yet here was the undeniable reality. A patrol had erased its own advantage and reported it without apology. Inside the unit itself, there was no sense of scandal, no sense of loss. The fire had been small, brief, unremarkable, necessary. The men moved on shortly afterward, leaving behind only a faint blackened patch on the ground where the map had existed. They did not look back. Their pace did not change. They carried no replacement. To outside observers, it would seem reckless, even insane. Soldiers chose blindness in a landscape where sight was survival, abandoning the one tool designed to anchor them in certainty. But those men were not lost. They knew exactly where they were. More unsettling still, they intended to remain that way, because the map had served its purpose, and keeping it any longer would have been the greater danger. This was the paradox that would ripple outward, unsettling assumptions far beyond that quiet patrol. because if destroying intelligence could make a unit safer, then everything about how armies understood control, knowledge, and survival had to be questioned. What kind of soldiers discarded certainty on purpose? What kind of unit trusted something else more than the accumulated knowledge of command? And what did they know that others didn't? The ashes cooled quickly. Within minutes, winds scattered them into the dirt, blending the remains of careful planning into the same earth the soldiers now crossed with empty hands and unbroken confidence. Whatever advantage the map had once given them was gone. But they had not weakened themselves. They had transformed, and far away, in rooms filled with maps that would never burn, men with authority would begin trying to understand a decision that violated every rule they believed kept soldiers alive. They would call it unnecessary, irresponsible, dangerous. They would be wrong. War in 1941 was supposed to be orderly. Divisions moved on maps. Arrows advanced across sand tables. Orders flowed downward in tidy chains of command. In Cairo and London, the British Army believed in weight of artillery, weight of manpower, weight of supply. War was a problem of scale. If you had more guns, more trucks, more fuel, you would win. And then a young Scottish officer with a broken spine began arguing that the entire system was wrong. David Stirling did not look like a man capable of reorganizing modern warfare. Tall, eccentric, barely disciplined by conventional standards, he had already failed in the eyes of many of his superiors. After a parachute training accident in North Africa left him hospitalized, immobilized, and furious, he began drafting an idea that bordered on heresy. He believed the British Army was thinking too loudly. In the vastness of the Western Desert, formations were visible from miles away. Convoys churned sand into plumes that could be seen from the air. Airfields sprawled in predictable grids, supply lines with thick veins stretching back to the Nile. Every move required reporting. Every action generated paperwork. Intelligence flowed upward. Decisions flowed downward. It was a machine designed for predictability. Stirling saw vulnerability. He understood something simple and radical. Information, not firepower, was the true center of gravity. Large formations required constant informational support to function radio traffic, logistics schedules, reconnaissance summaries. If you disrupted that system even slightly, the entire apparatus stiffened and slowed. So he proposed the opposite of scale. Instead of thousands of men supported by layers of staff officers, he envisioned 4 to 6 men inserted deep behind enemy lines, operating without continuous oversight, without heavy logistics, without the burden of bureaucracy. Small teams that carried their own intelligence. Small teams that made decisions on the ground. Small teams that did not need to ask permission. In the Western Desert, where German and Italian airfields were spread thin but vital to mobility, Stirling saw opportunity. Aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip were worth more than entire battalions of infantry. Destroying a single plane on the ground could neutralize weeks of training and production. Destroying 20 could shift an entire campaign, but here was the institutional fracture. The British Army of the early 1940s was built on command and control orthodoxy. Orders originated at headquarters. The initiative flowed cautiously. Autonomy was granted carefully and usually to senior officers. Intelligence was centralized. Risk was calculated through committees. Stirling's idea was removed by the committee. He proposed that small, hand-picked teams would decide their own routes, choose their own targets, and execute operations based on real-time observation rather than pre-approved scripts. They would operate in deliberate obscurity. Their success would depend on invisibility rather than spectacle. To traditional commanders, this bordered on insubordination, and yet the desert itself became his ally. The Western Desert was not merely sand. It was cold at night, scorching by day, a landscape that punished large formations with mechanical attrition. Engines clogged with grit, radiators boiled, supply lines stretched and snapped. But a handful of modified trucks, lightly loaded and driven by men who understood navigation by stars and compass bearings, could move where columns could not. The first missions were almost reckless. Early parachute insertions went wrong. Weather scattered teams. Men landed far from targets. Some were captured. Some barely made it back. By conventional standards, the experiment should have ended there. Instead, it adapted. Sterling partnered with the Long-Range Desert Group, borrowing their expertise in deep desert navigation. Trucks were stripped of excess weight and reinforced for endurance. Intelligence was gathered not through formal reports but through direct reconnaissance, eyes on airfields, counting aircraft, observing guard patterns, measuring response times. The philosophy sharpened. They would strike at night, on foot, planting timed explosives directly onto aircraft fuselages, not bombing from above, not shelling from distance, walking into the enemy's infrastructure and dismantling it by hand. It was not brute force, it was surgical entropy. In one raid alone, dozens of Axis aircraft were destroyed on the ground, not in a climactic battle, not after a prolonged firefight, but in minutes explosions rippled across tarmac as small teams slipped back into darkness. The numbers told a story that headquarters could not ignore. A few dozen men were achieving material destruction disproportionate to their size. The cost-to-impact ratio defied conventional doctrine. Instead of deploying hundreds to seize territory, they deployed 6 to erase capability. This was not recklessness, it was a competing military philosophy. Where the orthodox model believed in control through information saturation, Sterling's model believed in advantage through information or autonomy. A small unit, physically present at the decisive point, did not require constant updates from distant staff officers. It generated its own intelligence in real time. It collapsed the distance between observation and action. Decision cycles shortened. Risk localized. Bureaucracy thinned. The Special Air Service was born not from rebellion, but from a logical extension of a brutal environment. Its name itself was deception, suggesting a larger airborne formation than actually existed. Even its identity was a form of operational misdirection. And beneath the audacity lay discipline of a different kind. Selection was ruthless. Physical endurance was only the beginning. What mattered more was composure under isolation, the ability to navigate alone, the capacity to make lethal decisions without immediate supervision. Men who required constant affirmation or rigid instruction simply did not fit. In this way, the SAS rejected hierarchy without rejecting professionalism. Rank mattered less than competence. Authority flowed from capability. A corporal with the right expertise could shape an operation as decisively as a captain. The institutional contrast widened. The British Army optimized for mass coordination. The SAS is optimized for precision disruption. One believed safety lay in numbers and oversight. The other believed effectiveness lay in small teams operating beyond the predictable reach of both enemy and bureaucracy. Neither philosophy was inherently reckless. Both were internally consistent. But one was designed for visible battlefields. The other thrived in the shadows. By the end of the Desert Campaign, the data was undeniable. Axis air power in North Africa had been eroded not only by dogfights and bombing runs, but by men who arrived unannounced in the night and vanished before dawn. Aircraft destroyed on the ground meant fewer sorties over British lines. Fewer sorties meant fewer casualties. The ripple effect moved outward, invisible but measurable. The regiment had not simply executed daring raids, it had rewritten the relationship between size and effect. And in doing so, it created a fault line inside modern warfare, a question that would echo long after the desert cooled. Is power measured by how much you control, or by how little you need to? The answer, born under desert stars and sealed with burning aircraft, would define the identity of the SAS ace generations. By the time the coordinates were transmitted, the war had already entered its quiet phase, the phase where headlines faded. But the killing did not. The theater was a fractured river valley straddling the borderlands of a nation that officially did not host foreign troops. Satellite imagery showed mud brick compounds stitched along irrigation canals, green against a sea of dust. To the untrained eye, it was farmland. To military planners, it was a smuggling artery, a logistical spine feeding weapons, fighters, and money into 3 separate insurgent cells operating within a 60-kilometer radius. Command called it a denial corridor. The insurgents called it a sanctuary. The mission was straightforward on paper: insert a 4-man reconnaissance element from the Special Air Service under cover of darkness, move 6 kilometers east from the drop zone, establish overwatch on a suspected high-value facilitator's compound, confirm presence, and mark for capture. No direct action unless compromised. In and out within 12 hours. Simple, but nothing in that valley had been simple for over a decade. At brigade headquarters, 2 time zones away and sealed inside climate-controlled modular containers, the map that produced those coordinates had been assembled across 3 different intelligence streams. Signals intercepted first, bursts of encrypted traffic spiking every Thursday at precisely 2300 local time. Pattern of life analysis suggested a courier meet. Then came overhead imagery, 2 vehicles arriving, lights cut before entry, no thermal bleed from cooking fires during the meeting window. A cold house. Finally, a human source category B reliability, meaning previously accurate but financially motivated, who claimed the compound belonged to a mid-tier logistics broker moving foreign fighters across the river. 3 streams, independent confirmation, enough to be brief. The coordinates were generated by a targeting cell operating under relentless tempo. 12 active missions that week, 32 named individuals under surveillance, a mandate from higher headquarters to demonstrate operational persistence before the end of the quarter. Funding reviews were approaching. Effectiveness metrics mattered. Maps in that environment become more than paper. They become proof of momentum. The analyst who overlaid the final grid had been awake 19 hours. He adjusted the satellite layer to compensate for a recent sandstorm, cross-referenced with archived imagery, and snapped the cursor to what appeared to be the primary entrance, an L-shaped wall, casting a consistent shadow across 3 separate passes. He labeled it Objective Indigo. The operations officer reviewed the packet at 4:30. The colonel skimmed the executive summary. Legal clearance stamped proportionality and necessity. The mission was green-lit in under 12 minutes. Everyone believed they were transmitting clarity. What they actually transmitting was certainty. And certainty in irregular warfare is a dangerous thing. Back in the valley, the terrain did not care about briefings. The air carried the metallic tang of irrigation pumps and the faint rot of stagnant water. Dogs barked intermittently through the night, then stopped all at once when engines passed. Wind pushed fine silt into every seam of clothing, every optic lens. The SAS team received the coordinates as nothing more than numbers, 8 digits, split by latitude and longitude. To them it meant a point in darkness, a distance to pace, a wall to count steps against. But embedded in those numbers were assumptions that the human source had not been compromised, that the compound's function had not changed in the weeks between satellite passes, that the encrypted bursts corresponded to that location and not the adjacent cluster 300 meters south, that the insurgents had not learned to manipulate thermal signatures, that the irrigation canal had not been rerouted, shifting natural foot traffic patterns. Each assumption was small. Together, they formed a doctrine. In counterinsurgency, doctrine favors pattern recognition. If traffic spikes here and vehicles arrive here and money flows here, then this is the node. It's logical, it's efficient, it's scalable. But insurgents study doctrine, the way soldiers study weapons manuals. Inside headquarters, there had been debate brief, procedural, almost sterile. One junior imagery analyst noted that the compound's northern wall appeared recently repaired. Fresh mud, lighter in tone. She flagged it in an annotation layer. The note was logged but not elevated. Wall repairs were common after seasonal flooding. No tactical significance assessed. A signals officer questioned why the encrypted traffic dropped to 0 for 2 consecutive Thursdays before resuming. The explanation: equipment, maintenance, or temporary relocation. Pattern disruption did not equal pattern invalidation. The pressure to maintain continuity overrode the instinct to interrogate anomaly. No one lied. No one lied. No one falsified data. The map was built honestly, meticulously, but it was built within a system that rewards coherence. The kernel needed actionable grids. The targeting cell needed closure on a suspect. The intelligence fusion team needed confirmation that their layered model worked, and so the model became the mission. What the command believed they were transmitting was a verified facilitator's compounder node in a supply chain responsible for at least 17 confirmed weapons transfers over 3 months, a man linked indirectly to 2 improvised explosive devices that had killed Allied police officers. Removing him would fracture a network. Metrics would reflect impact. Momentum would continue. The coordinates were, in their minds, a scalpel. Yet one tactical detail inside that packet was wrong, not catastrophically obvious, not something that would trigger red alarms in the operations center. It was embedded deep classified at a level that did not require dissemination to the 4 men on the ground, a nuance in how the compound was assessed, a contextual qualifier trimmed from the summary slide to keep the briefing within 10 minutes. It concerned occupancy. Specifically, who was believed to be inside during the Thursday window. The human source had provided 2 versions of that detail across separate debriefs. In one, the facilitator arrived alone with a driver. In the other, he hosted extended family who remained overnight for protection. The discrepancy was documented, but confidence weighting favored the first account. Less complexity. Cleaner target picture. The second version required escalation to a higher legal review threshold. It implied collateral risk. It slowed timelines, so it remained in the annex. The annex was not transmitted to the patrol. On the ground, the SAS team prepared under the assumption of minimal resistance and controlled occupancy. Their rules of engagement reflected that framing. Their insertion weight, ammunition load, and contingency planning all flowed from it. And somewhere between the satellite pass and the rotor wash of the insertion aircraft, the valley shifted. Irrigation pumps were moved. A wall was extended. A family arrived from across the river seeking shelter from rival fighters. Or perhaps none of that happened. Perhaps something else did. The truth had not yet revealed itself. But the coordinates contained more than a location. They contained institutional momentum, filtered intelligence, budget cycles, career trajectories, and a belief in the stability of patterns within an unstable war. As the encrypted transmission reached the team leader's handheld device and the numbers flickered into confirmation, headquarters exhaled. Another operation synchronized, another proof point in the campaign's geometry. In the operations center, screens glowed with layered grids and digital overlays. In the valley, the night swallowed depth perception whole, and between those 2 worlds sat a single detail, wrong, misclassified or misunderstood, waiting to convert assumption into consequence. The map was clean, the terrain was not, and somewhere inside those 8 digits was the beginning of a fracture that had nothing to do with the 4 men moving silently through dust toward objective indigo. The grid was clean, too clean, 6 digits, confirmed twice, routed through the battalion, cleared through fires. On paper, it was a gift, a hardened insurgent relay site sitting almost politely inside a killbox already approved for engagement. But standing on that ridgeline with the wind dragging sand across his boots, the patrol commander knew something the paper did not. Silence, not the peaceful kind, the wrong kind. The valley below lay stretched under a thin haze, afternoon heat distorting the lines of mud walls and irrigation cuts into wavering ghosts. A single dirt road carved through the center like a vein. The coordinate pulsed on his handheld screen, blue grid square overlaid against satellite imagery taken weeks ago. Weeks ago in a war that shifted by the hour. He lowered the device and listened. No diesel generators humming. No diesel generators humming. No distant goat bells, no radio chatter bleeding from civilian sets, just wind scraping dry grass against stone. Even the flies seemed absent. Behind him, 8 men waited in staggered cover positions, rifles resting on packs, eyes scanning sectors they'd scanned 100 times before. Sweat cut dark lines through the dust on their faces. They trusted him, but trust had weight. It pressed between the shoulder blades, Grid confirms, the forward observer whispered, not because the enemy was near, but because uncertainty demanded quiet. Fires ready on call. The institutional machinery was already moving. Air support loitered outside visual range. Artillery tubes 15 kilometers away had traversed, elevation set, powder charges counted. The system loved coordinates. Coordinates were obedient. They fit inside doctrine, but doctrine had scars. He'd seen them. 3 months earlier, another unit, same province, similar terrain, received coordinates just as precise. A verified weapons cache tucked into a walled compound. They were executed by the book. Positive identification through optics. Clearance obtained. Rounds on target in under 3 minutes. What the feed didn't show until after impact was the wedding canopy strung inside the courtyard. White fabric igniting mid-air, debris lifting into a cloud that swallowed music and laughter in the same breath. The insurgents had known how Western targeting worked. They planted radios inside civilian gatherings before. They understood response times down to the minute. 47 non-combatants. The numbers came later, recited in clipped voices under fluorescent lighting. But the sound that stayed with him was the delay, the half-second between impact flash and the screaming that followed on open comms. Pattern recognition is not instinct. It is an accumulation. He looked again at the valley. The compound identified by the grid sat too exposed, its outer wall intact but freshly repaired in places that didn't match older satellite imagery. No movement, no guards on the roofline, no heat signature spikes through thermal beyond ambient round temperature. Insurgents protected assets with layers. This had none. His radio crackled. Battalion operations, status on fire request. There it was, the clock. He could comply, lob the strike, execute cleanly. If wrong, the system would absorb it. Investigation, review board, procedural language. He would remain within the architecture. Or he could hold. Holding meant friction. It meant explaining why a validated coordinate wasn't being serviced. It meant suggesting that intelligence might be compromised or manipulated. Institutions resist that suggestion. He shifted his weight, gravel crunching under boot soles loud as a snapped branch. His senior NCO crawled beside him, face close enough to feel breath through dust masks. "Feels wrong," the NCO muttered. That was the entire conversation. Because wrong in this environment didn't mean fear. It meant misalignment. It meant variables not syncing with memory. Wind direction inconsistent with cooking smoke patterns. Road ruts too undisturbed for a site allegedly active within 48 hours. Absence of security overwatch. It meant the valley felt staged. He raised binoculars, sweeping left. On the far edge of the irrigation ditch, half concealed in reeds, something metallic caught the light. Not a weapon, a cable, running from the ditch toward the compound wall. He lowered the optics slowly. Insurgents in this region had begun experimenting with command-detonated charges triggered by visual confirmation of approaching patrols. Bait sites, false caches, the real payload buried along likely approach routes. The coordinate might not mark a target. It might mark a magnet. He keyed the radio. Negative fires at this time, conducting pattern confirmation. A pause long enough to feel deliberate. "Clarify," the battalion replied. He exhaled once, steady. "Recommend hold. The site lacks expected activity indicators, possible deception. Request ISR for thermal sweep of irrigation line and secondary compounds." Silence again, this time institutional. Above, unseen, a drone adjusted its orbit. Minutes stretched. The patrol remained frozen, muscles beginning to tremble not from exertion but from delay. Delay in combat feels like exposure. Every second suggests unseen eyes calibrating distance. Then the feed came through. Thermal bloom. Not in the compound, along the ditch. A chain of buried signatures spaced 5 meters apart, shallow, recent soil displacement radiating heat from sun absorption. Unevenly. Pressure plates. A corridor designed to guide foot movement toward the grid square. The compound itself was hollow. Walls intact, interior stripped, a shell. The realization landed not as triumph but as cold confirmation. The insurgents had mapped response behavior. They understood that Western forces preferred distance engagement when possible. If air or artillery struck the empty compound, the true target would remain untouched. If a patrol advanced to confirm, they would channel into explosives. Either outcome served the deception. He pressed transmit again. You recommend alternate action. Marking ditch line for precision strike. Compound assessed as decoy. This time the reply was immediate. Approved. Stand by. When the rounds came, they walked the irrigation line first. Controlled detonations rippled beneath the soil, secondary explosions popping in rapid succession as buried charges cooked off. Dust columns rose in a staggered sequence like a zipper tearing open the valley floor. Only after the ditch was neutralized did they collapse the compound, not as target destruction, but as denial. The empty walls folded inward, sending a plume skyward that erased the bait entirely. The patrol remained in position until the smoke thinned. No screaming on comms, no aftermath report. Just wind returning to its earlier rhythm. Later, analysts would log it as enemy emplacement disrupted, clean phrasing. Efficient. But what shifted in that moment was not a structure. It was the unspoken contract between man and doctrine. Across the province, weeks before, another commander had followed coordinates without deviation. He had done everything correctly within policy. The insurgents had studied that correctness and weaponized it. Catastrophe had not come from recklessness, it had come from predictability. This decision, to withhold fire, to question, to disrupt the rhythm, was not defiance, it was an adaptation. Behind enemy lines, obedience can be fatal, but so can arrogance. The thin line between them is measured not in paperwork, but in seconds, in the space between a coordinate on a screen and the terrain beneath your boots. As the patrol began its cautious withdrawal, boots now stepping where explosions had already sterilized the ground, the commander did not feel vindicated. He felt older, because somewhere beyond the next ridgeline, insurgent planners would be recalibrating. They would note the hesitation, the altered strike pattern. They would evolve again. And the next grid that appeared clean might not be empty. The mystery was not solved. It had only shifted shape. The valley swallowed the smoke. The radio returned to routine traffic. But for the men on that ridge, the lesson hardened into something institutional memory rarely records, that survival in modern war belongs to those who recognize when the map is lying and have the nerve to say so before the first round is fired. The first shots weren't fired on the battlefield. They were fired in a briefing room. 3 weeks after the patrol returned, boots still dusted with the same desert grit that had clung to them that night. The regiment was ordered to present itself, not before an enemy, but before its own command structure. Fluorescent lights hummed. Folders lay stacked in neat geometric precision. A wall map displayed the operational grid in clean, sterile lines. What had unfolded in chaos was now reduced to symbols and arrows. The accusation was simple. They had violated standing orders. They had violated standing orders. They had deviated from the intelligence brief. They had acted without authorization. And somewhere inside those charges was a deeper, more dangerous implication. If the SAS had been right to act, then the intelligence picture, the foundation of the operation, had been wrong. For a modern military command, that possibility is not just embarrassing. It is existential. The inquiry convened under formal authority. A brigadier chaired it. Legal officers were present. Intelligence analysts sat along the back wall, their faces impassive. Audio recorders clicked on. The tone was procedural, but the atmosphere was electric. The regiment was asked to explain why they had broken contact with the assigned corridor, why they had disregarded updated threat assessments, why they had chosen to maneuver against a position that higher headquarters had assessed as non-viable hostile capacity. The language was clinical, but the subtext was clear. You disobeyed. What the inquiry did not ask, at least not initially, was why, and that omission revealed the psychology at work. Modern command structures are built on a hierarchy of trust. Intelligence flows downward, orders flow downward, accountability flows upward. The architecture depends on a central premise. The higher you sit, the broader your perspective. Satellites, intercepts, aggregated reports, command sees the whole chessboard. But special operations units operate at the edge of that map. They move inside the blind spots. They operate in terrain where signal degrades, where human behavior outpaces analysis, where the ground truth evolves minute by minute. That night, when the patrol intercepted the first irregular radio traffic, it did not match the intelligence summary. When thermal optics revealed vehicle signatures inconsistent with prior reconnaissance, it did not align with the brief. And when the local pattern of light shifted, lights extinguishing in sequence, movement patterns tightening, the team leader made a decision that directly contradicted the plan on paper. He chose the reality in front of him over the authority above him. In the inquiry room, that decision was dissected frame by frame. After action reports were projected onto the wall, timestamps glowed in white digital precision. The deviation occurred at 02:17. The maneuver initiated at 02217. The maneuver initiated at 0222. Contact established at 0229. By 0241, the engagement had neutralized the hostile node that intelligence had labeled as dormant. Dormant. The word hung in the air. Signal intelligence officers were called to testify. They explained that their assessment was based on pattern analysis over a 72-hour window. No anomalous chatter. No heat signatures exceeding baseline thresholds, no drone imagery indicating fortification, but they had been looking at averages. The SAS had been looking at the ground. One operator described the smell of fresh earth near what had been mapped as an abandoned compound. Another described the sound, metallic clatter carried on crosswind, impossible to detect from altitude. A third spoke about the silence, the unnatural absence of dogs in nearby villages. These were not data points in a system, they were human anomalies, and they had recognized them. The tension inside the room shifted when the casualty projection slide appeared. Had the patrol adhered to the assigned corridor, they would have crossed a narrow defile at 03035, a choke point. Intelligence had assessed it as clear. Post-engagement exploitation revealed that the hostile element had pre-positioned anti-vehicle munitions along that exact route between 0140 and 0210 after the last drone pass, before the patrol would have arrived. The ambush had been invisible to headquarters. It had been visible to the men on the ground. A silence followed that revelation. Not the silence of agreement, but the silence of institutional recalibration. Because now the inquiry faced a question more uncomfortable than disobedience. Had command nearly maneuvered its own unit into a kill zone? The brigadier pressed on. Why not request confirmation before deviating? Why not escalate concerns through the chain? The answer was procedural and brutal in its simplicity. Communications latency was 12 minutes round trip under optimal conditions. Terrain interference degraded signal strength. By the time confirmation would have returned, the window would have closed, or worse, the defile would have swallowed them. The SAS doctrine emphasizes decentralized decision-making under constrained timelines, mission command, intent over instruction, initiative within commander's purpose. But doctrine is one thing, institutional ego is another. Behind the formal questions lay something unspoken. If field units can override centralized intelligence, what does that mean for centralized authority? The inquiry began pulling declassified intercept logs. A pattern emerged. 2 prior operations in adjacent sectors had reported similar anomalies, short bursts of encrypted traffic dismissed as atmospheric distortion, minor deviations in thermal readings labeled as equipment error. Individually insignificant, collectively suggestive, the system had filtered out the noise. The SAS had stepped into it. In testimony, one intelligence captain admitted under questioning that confirmation bias had influenced the threat assessment. The operational narrative had framed the sector as stabilizing. Data inconsistent with that trajectory required higher evidentiary thresholds to be escalated. In other words, the system preferred consistency over disruption. The regiment had disrupted it. The human dimension surfaced next. Operators described stress indicators during the patrol, heart rate spiking above 150 beats per minute before any visual contact. Peripheral vision narrowing, the physical intuition that something was wrong. These are not mystical instincts. They are neurobiological responses to pattern recognition under threat. Years of combat compress into milliseconds of subconscious calculation. No satellite experiences that. The inquiry's tone shifted from accusatory to analytical, not because the institution conceded fault, but because the evidence forced complexity. The after-action battlefield damage assessment showed that the hostile node eliminated that night had been coordinating movement across a 40-kilometer corridor. Within 48 hours of its removal, intercepted communications in the region dropped by 63%. Supply convoys previously targeted experienced 0 engagements in the following 2 weeks. The mission's strategic objective, freedom of movement along that corridor, had been achieved not by adherence to plan, but by deviation from it. The paradox was unavoidable. Command had not been betrayed. Command had not been betrayed. Command had been protected, but institutions do not easily indict themselves. The final report, circulated in controlled distribution, used careful language. It acknowledged unanticipated adversary repositioning. It commended the regiment's tactical adaptability under fluid conditions. It recommended enhanced synchronization between field-level observations and centralized analysis. What it did not state outright was that the intelligence assessment had been wrong. Instead, responsibility was diffused across phrasing and passive voice. This is how systems preserve themselves. Yet within internal briefings, a quieter recognition took hold. The architecture of modern warfare, networked, data-saturated, algorithm-assisted, had met its limit at the edge of terrain. Sensors aggregate, analysts interpret, command decides. But at 02:17 on that night, none of those layers could smell the earth or hear the metal or feel the silence. Only the men there could, and they chose operational reality over institutional certainty. The deeper indictment was not of any individual officer. It was of a structural vulnerability, the belief that information density equals clarity. In truth, more data can harden assumptions. It can create narrative momentum that resists contradiction. The SAS did not defy authority for ego. They recalibrated the mission against unfolding evidence. They operated inside the commander's intent, even as they stepped outside his instructions. By the inquiry's conclusion, no formal reprimand was issued, no careers ended, the regiment returned to rotation, but something had shifted. Intelligence fusion protocols were amended, field anomaly reporting thresholds were lowered, decentralized decision-making language was reinforced in doctrinal updates. Quietly, without public acknowledgement, the institution absorbed the lesson, because the real threat that night had not been a hostile cell in a compound. It had been the possibility that the system's confidence exceeded its perception. In the sterile light of that briefing room, amid maps and memoranda, the collision between authority and reality had unfolded with less noise than the firefight, but with far greater consequence. And in that collision, it was not the command structure that saved the mission. It was the men who were willing to risk being wrong in order to be right. The order arrives clean, typed, numbered, authenticated. It carries rank, insignia, the full gravitational weight of an institution. On paper, it is lawful. On paper, it is precise. On paper, it is wrong. This is the moment no recruitment poster ever shows. In most military systems, obedience is oxygen. It keeps formations intact, hierarchies stable, wars predictable. Armies run on compliance the way engines run on fuel. Strip it away and the machine seizes. But inside the culture of the Special Air Service, obedience has always carried an asterisk. Because the mission does not care about paperwork, the terrain does not care about intent, and the enemy certainly does not care about doctrine written by someone 3 time zones away. The psychological architecture of refusal is not rebellion, it is not ego, it is not theatrics. It is the capacity to absorb consequences in order to preserve outcomes. To understand what that costs, you have to understand who the SAS selects for. Selection is not simply a filter for endurance. Yes, Candidates are pushed across the Brecon beacons under load until ligaments fray and lungs burn metallic. Yes, sleep is rationed, calories cut, navigation performed alone across featureless ground where a single grid error can mean hours lost. But the deeper test is not physical collapse. It is cognitive independence under stress. Candidates are observed when they are exhausted, when they're cold, when they believe no one is watching. Do they cling to instruction as a lifeline, or do they adapt? The regiment is not searching for compliant excellence. It is searching for disciplined, because the kind of soldier who can quietly burn an order without burning the institution must possess a rare internal geometry. He must understand doctrine well enough to know when it fails. He must respect hierarchy enough to avoid humiliating it. And he must accept that the consequences of refusal will not be shared. When an SAS patrol leader in the South Atlantic in 1982 chose to modify or delay a directive during the Falklands War, it was not framed as defiance, it was framed as survival. Weather windows over the islands could collapse in minutes. Helicopter flight envelopes narrowed by sleet and crosswind. Argentine radar arcs shifted. Intelligence aged in hours. The map in London was static, the peat underfoot was not. Disobedience in that context was not ideological, it was temporal. The battlefield was moving faster than the order. Years later, in the deserts of southern Iraq after 2003, the same cultural DNA reappeared. Conventional units operated inside rigid patrol templates and predictable route cycles. The SAS operated in fluid, intelligence-driven cells, adjusting targets, shifting timelines, compressing action to exploitation loops. When friction appeared between theater command expectations and ground truth, friction did not always resolve upward. Sometimes it resolved sideways. The paradox at the center of elite military culture is this: the most effective operators are often the least predictable subordinates. This is not celebrated openly. Institutions fear precedent. If one unit refuses what prevents others from following, bureaucracies survive on replicable behavior. Refusal is, by nature, non-replicable. It depends on judgment, and judgment cannot be mass-produced. That is why refusal inside the SAS is not romanticized. It is contained, it is contextual, it is expensive. The cost begins internally. To override an order is to step alone into uncertainty. If the mission succeeds, the deviation may never be documented. If it fails, the paper trail is merciless. Careers in the British Army are not destroyed by battlefield losses alone, they are destroyed by procedural breaches. A single finding of failure to follow directive can end promotion pathways permanently. Decorations evaporate. Command opportunities vanish. And yet, within the regiment's culture there exists an unspoken calculus. Better to be professionally punished than operationally responsible for preventable deaths. Imagine the micro scene. A four-man patrol lies prone on cold shale above a suspected weapons cache. Signals intercepted suggest movement at first light. The brigade has ordered immediate engagement to demonstrate presence, but the patrol leader has watched the pattern for 36 hours. He senses staging, not stockpiling. A premature strike will scatter the network. He whispers a decision, hold. He knows the brigade expects contact reports by dawn. He knows questions will follow. Dawn passes. No strike. By noon, a convoy arrives. Larger, heavier, command elements exposed. The network consolidates. The patrol calls it in, adjusts, shapes the battlefield on its own timeline. The result is decisive. On paper, the delay was insubordination. In reality, it was operational patience. This pattern-quiet recalibration in the face of rigid expectation did not remain confined to one regiment. It influenced how Western special operations evolved. Mission command doctrine, the delegation of decision-making authority downward, gained credibility not through theory, but through results. From the Falklands to Basra to Helmand, the measurable outcome was stark. Smaller autonomous teams consistently outpaced larger, centrally controlled formations in adaptability. The legacy rippled outward. Allied special operations units studied the British model. Autonomy under intent became embedded in training pipelines from Australia to North America. The idea that elite units must cultivate critical thinkers, not obedient executors, shifted from fringe philosophy to mainstream doctrine, but the moral layer remains unsettled, because refusal corrodes certainty. It forces soldiers to decide which oath they are honoring, obedience to command, or duty to mission and men. Those are not always the same. The psychological burden compounds over time. To habitually question authority is to live in quiet vigilance. It isolates. It creates distance between operator and institution. Many SAS veterans describe a difficulty reintegrating into conventional command structures later in their careers. The reflex to evaluate, to adjust, to override once life-saving become friction in peacetime hierarchy. And there is another cost. If refusal becomes identity, humility must counterbalance it. The line between principled dissent and arrogance is razor-thin. Selection attempts to screen for that balance, but it is never guaranteed. The same independence that preserves life can, unchecked, fracture cohesion. This is the moral architecture at the heart of elite soldiering, not aggression, not bravado, but calibrated defiance. It is uncomfortable, it cannot be neatly codified, it resists slogans. Yet across 4 decades of modern conflict, the operational record stands as quiet testimony. Units empowered to think have consistently adapted faster than enemies and bureaucracies alike. The numbers tell part of the story: shorter engagement cycles, higher value targets disrupted, lower friendly casualty ratios in certain theaters. But the deeper metric is less tangible: trust. Trust that a man on the ground, breathing the dust, hearing the wind against broken masonry, feeling the tempo of a village at dusk, might understand reality better than a command post screen. In the end, the SAS did not institutionalize disobedience. It institutionalized judgment. And judgment is heavier than obedience. It demands moral courage not once but repeatedly. It demands acceptance that integrity may cost promotion, praise, even belonging. It demands that when the typed order arrives clean, numbered, authenticated, a soldier can look at it, measure it against the terrain, the enemy, the lives in his care, and decide. Not recklessly, not emotionally, but correctly. That is the unseen architecture behind every silent deviation that saved a patrol, every altered timeline that collapsed a network, every mission that succeeded because someone was willing to stand between paper and reality. And it is why the most effective soldiers in the modern era are not those who follow orders fastest. They are the ones who know, with absolute clarity, when not to. At the beginning, it looked like defiance. A map laid across a rough wooden table, edges curling from humidity. Inked lines representing divisions, roads, timelines, expectations, and then the flame, deliberate, steady, consuming it. An officer standing in the half-light, choosing ash over obedience. At first glance it felt like insubordination, a breach of discipline. A dangerous gamble made by a man too confident in his own judgment. But now, with the distance of consequence, the act reveals itself differently. The map was never just paper. It was authority condensed into symbols. It was headquarters confidence, translated into arrows and objectives. It was the weight of a chain of command extending hundreds of miles away, blind to the texture of mud under boots and the smell of cordite hanging low in the valley. Burning it was not rebellion. It was not rebellion. It was doctrine, just not the kind printed in manuals. Long before satellites, long before encrypted live feeds and command centers glowing with screens, certain military cultures understood a brutal truth: intelligence decays with distance. The further it travels from the ground, the more it becomes assumption, the more it becomes theory. And theory, in combat, kills. The officer who burned that map was not rejecting command. He was executing a higher principle embedded deep within the philosophy of decentralized warfare, what the Prussians would call Auftragstaktik, mission-type orders. Commanders provide intent, subordinates determine execution, not because hierarchy is weak, but because friction is real. On that night, with enemy movement shifting in ways the map did not predict, the choice was simple and lethal. Trust the ink or trust the ground. He chose the ground. He chose the ground. He chose the ground. That decision did not exist in isolation. It became a precedent, quietly studied, quietly internalized, passed down not as a dramatic story, but as institutional memory, in after-action reports, in war colleges, and the unspoken understanding between special operators who know that sometimes the most dangerous moment is when higher command sounds most certain. Modern special operations units operate with a paradoxical combination of discipline and autonomy. They are briefed with extraordinary detail, satellite imagery, signals, intercepts, predictive modeling, yet once wheels lift off the runway, something shifts. Real-time command dependency loosens. The tether stretches. Because the doctrine now encoded into elite forces is clear, the operator on the ground is the final authority on reality. Autonomous unit intelligence, distributed decision-making, command intent over command micromanagement. Tier 1 elements deliberately decoupled from constant oversight so that speed and adaptation survive the first contact with chaos. This philosophy was not born in comfort. It was forged in moments like that burning map, when obedience threatened effectiveness. Consider the arithmetic of delay. A transmission routed through multiple headquarters layers can take minutes. In a firefight, minutes equal lives. A misread terrain feature on a digital map can misplace a squad by 50 meters. 50 meters can mean walking into an enfilade instead of flanking it. Intelligence that is 90% accurate at headquarters may be 10% fatal at the point of contact. And so modern doctrine institutionalizes distrust, not of leadership, but of certainty. The burning of the map was the physical manifestation of a hard-earned realization. Information is not sacred, intent is. There is a psychological cost to this freedom. Operators must carry responsibility normally absorbed by hierarchy. They must decide when to adapt and when to hold, when deviation is wisdom and when it is ego. That burden shapes identity. It accelerates maturity. It isolates. Because once you are entrusted with autonomous authority, you can never again hide behind orders. The ash on that table was not the destruction of guidance. It was the rejection of false clarity. And here lies the timeless lesson, extending far beyond battlefields. In warfare and in leadership, the most dangerous thing a soldier can carry is intelligence he has been ordered to trust but cannot verify. Blind compliance feels safe. It feels orderly. It feels loyal. But when reality contradicts instruction, survival belongs to those trained to reconcile the two without hesitation. The officer who burned the map understood something uncomfortable. Institutions must empower judgment at the edge, or they will calcify at the center. Today's most capable special operations forces are built on that understanding. Mission-type orders, decentralized execution, commanders articulating purpose, not scripting movement. The deliberate acceptance that control must sometimes be surrendered to preserve effectiveness. The flame at the beginning of this story was not reckless, it was disciplined. It was a refusal to let distance dictate destiny. Paper turned to ash, intent endured. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of modern military planning, that lesson still flickers, a reminder that in the friction of war, certainty is combustible, and wisdom often smells faintly of smoke.